What we do not see is God unleashing his wrath, but actually it says in Genesis 6:6 that God's heart
Hmm.
was
Hmm.
grieved from what he saw and all that he had made. And that really, in that sense, the flood is an expression of God's grief at the brokenness, as well as his intention to bring about some kind of redemption from this brokenness. So how can you help us? Maybe you can just describe, how does God's reasoning in giving this flood help us understand the story?
Yeah, so I think it's important that the assessment of creation as ruined happens prior to the flood. So there's a dramatic moment in 6, 11, and 12 where in Hebrew, the pattern is very similar to Genesis 1:31 because it says, God looked at the earth and behold, it was, and then it gives an assessment, which is in Genesis 1:31, it was, God looked at the earth and behold, it was very good. And here he looks at
Mhm,
the earth and behold, it was ruined. And so that's prior to the flood. And so, but then it goes on to say, so God decided to ruin the earth. And I'm thinking, well, how do you ruin something that's already ruined? Well, I think that's why I use that analogy of termites having eaten out the structure of the house. So you look at the house and it's still standing, but the inspector notes that like one strong gust of wind and this thing is going to fall over. And
yeah.
it's not safe for habitation. And it's, in fact, you can already hear things creaking about to collapse. And in essence,
Mhm,
what the text describes as the flood is the collapsing of creation. It says the fountains of the deep burst, the windows of the heaven burst open, and everything went back to that watery formlessness that it began with. So,
mhm,
to use Terence Fretheim's language, what God did in ruining the earth is he facilitated the natural consequences of sin, or of
mhm,
violence in this case, as they had eaten out the foundations, the structure of creation. And
mhm,
the other analogy I use is of a potter who is spinning clay on a wheel. And if you're spinning clay and you look down and you see that bowl that you're trying to make has holes in it and air bubbles and pieces are flapping off, it's ruined. It's an accurate assessment. And so what you have to do
mhm,
is return it to useful formlessness. And so the flood, which is done in God's grieving heart, as you noted in 6:6, God returning creation to useful formlessness so that he can remake it. And I think this is another story that's in conversation with other ancient Near Eastern stories because the flood stories were common in the ancient world. And in many ways, the question wasn't whether you're going to have a flood story, but how you're going to tell it. And you had a difficulty as a monotheist because you can't have a protagonist God saying build a boat and an
mhm,
antagonist God sending a flood. But in the biblical account, the antagonist is violence because that's the thing that
mm,
ruins creation. And the protagonist is Yahweh who preserves life in the ark. And then it's that's the sort of the way that the conditions are set for, all right, we're back to Genesis 1, 2. God is going to send his breath or spirit over the water again, as it describes in 8:1, and dry land is going to appear again. And then you have this sort of new creation account, after which God covenants with creation that this would not happen again.
mm.